Maria van Vakino is perhaps keeps a reasonably low profile Australia-wide, but she's very, very well known out there in the northern part of Melbourne as the MHR for Calwell. And she's had to deal with a lot of these issues because she's close to the communities there, where there have been and still are today some issues. So please welcome Maria.
Joe, it's a great pleasure to be here. As Des has also indicated, the federal seat of Calwell, which I represent and have represented in the Parliament since November 2011, it occurred to me when I gave some thought today to what I might say as a way of starting conversation, has been pretty much in the eye of the storm, or at the hot seat of the events of the September 11 decade, which spurred a lot of and gave rise, I think, to a lot of the interfaith activity that we saw take place in Australia in the last decade. I'll begin by just saying that I know something about Joe that who's who won't tell you, Des, and I know that because Joe's told me, and I can imagine it, that when he came here and migrated to Fawkner in the northern suburbs from cosmopolitan Alexandria, he went for a walk with his mother, Polixeni, and was quite taken aback by the fact that there were no people on the streets. So the question that Joe put to his mother was, is there a war here? And I think that gives us a very good indication of where Australia was at that period when Joe came here and when I migrated to Australia in '63, that period when Arthur Calwell was the migration minister, when Australia was opening itself up to the rest of the world because it had to, and the famous populate or perish, that one might argue our migration system of that period, the post-Second World War migration program, visionary and provocative and difficult as I imagine it would have been at the time to sell to the local Australians who came from a particular country and had a particular colouring and a particular persuasion, cultural, linguistic and faith persuasion. It would have been very difficult to have sold to that community the notion that people from all over the world, in this case Europe, Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, Southern Europe, were going to suddenly come here and become Australians. So I'm part of that process. So I often like to reflect on the 50 years of my being here, of the 60 years of Call's Australians. As a politician, I represent a seat that's very diverse. I have a great interest in auditing, just as Joe has suggested we take stock of interfaith activity of the last decade, and he's absolutely correct that we do that. In the last Parliament, when I chaired the last term of the 43rd Parliament, when I chaired the Migration Committee, it was also my intention as the chair to put forward, and thankfully government and opposition agreed at the time, that we should take stock on multiculturalism and the 40-odd years of public policy that it was, because things didn't happen accidentally in this country. We didn't just all come together from everywhere with all our differences, agreeing that we all had things in common, so let's live together. I mean, there were interventions, there were programs, there were political decisions that were made, and those decisions around multiculturalism gave rise to the Racial Discrimination Act. They paved the way for interfaith dialogue, I believe, to happen when it did at a very critical time. So we took our inquiry, it's lasted for 2 years. It received about 500 submissions, and Chapter 5 of the report is dedicated exclusively to Islam, because most of some 280 of the submissions that we got came from individuals and organisations that were against multiculturalism because they saw it as divisive, and they warned and sounded all sorts of alarm bells that effectively were about Islam. When you peeled away the concerns, what was being told to our committee, and what I know Interfaith has had to deal with, is that, oh, okay, you're a migrant, you're a Christian, that's fine, no problems with that. but it's the Muslims that don't integrate, and it's Islam that's the issue. And interfaith has spent the last, interfaith activity that Joe's referred to, has spent the last, in excess of a decade, dealing with those issues. And in Cornwall, we established an interfaith network just before September 11. I was still the candidate, and I actually chaired it for some time. And it was the beginning of politicians, local government, state government, authorities intervening and getting to know the community that, to me, I had known and had existed well before it was told to us that we actually had to get out there and know each other and understand each other. And the best way I can describe it, and I think I might keep it short because I'll be very keen to go to question and answer too. The best way I can describe it is that the people in my electorate who are of Muslim faith on September 12 woke up and they went from being migrants like everybody else and they became Muslims, and their life changed, and the way we looked at them changed, and the way we were told we had to look at them changed. And then multiculturalism, diversity, community, all of those things that the interfaith dialogue develops and works with became a matter of national security. So everything that government funded, and you're right, Joe, a lot of it was short term and it was putting out fires. But as a politician, I'll speak as a politician, politicians think in those terms. And they are directed and influenced, and in this case, by the authorities that were tasked with looking after the national security of Australia. And it was always my view personally that the Building, and I'll single one particular program that I think we're all familiar with, the Building Resilient Communities program administered by the Attorney Generals and so funded by millions and millions of dollars, was never really assessed and audited in a way that the community can understand whether there'd been any value for money, or the community had no idea. The programs were given, the money was given, they were reported, nobody really knew the results. It was actually people like Joe and the Centre for Dialogue and the interfaith communities, you made it your business to try and reach out to the broader community and help them understand what it is that was going on and why it was going on. So as you were speaking, I was thinking that I actually found this in my bag this afternoon, just sent to me. It's the Geert Wilders Australia Tour visit of 2030. And I hope that that's not at the La Mirage on Somerton, in Somerton, that particular staging. I don't think it is. But Geert Wilders actually did deliver, or try to deliver, his own type of dialogue. He was entering into dialogue with us as well in my electorate, which didn't surprise me in any ways, as I later discovered there'd been quite a bit of dialogue activity going on in the federal seat of Cornwall, but not the type that I was familiar with. It was another type of dialogue. It was the dialogue of Christians wishing to save the country from the Islamists, the sort of dialogue that Geert Wilders and the 290 odd submissions to the, I think, Migration Committee were actually inspired by. The sort of dialogue that followed us into the federal election of 2013 that saw the formation of the Christian Party in politics and seeking to, I guess, what would you call it? Would you call it dialogue with the broader community? So you have a candidate that wants you to vote for them because they're Christians, and I had a candidate on the other side of the Liberal Party who suggested that maybe we should be voting for him because he was a Muslim. So as a politician, politicians live in a dangerous world of cynicism and manipulation. The idea that in Australia we could be determining voting behaviour and thinking on the basis of faith is a dangerous thing, and I think we should actually look at that as part of some of the issues that could be presented as difficult and need to be dealt with. And I only raise it because that was the immediate experience that I had in my electorate. I've got a lot of notes here. I don't think I'm going to go through them, but I just wanted to say that I agree. I think Joe has given a very good summation of the history, of the chronology of dialogue, interfaith dialogue in this country and certainly internationally. I agree, we as a country need to not only move forward, but we also need to commit to a more deeper and viable understanding of what we mean by interfaith dialogue and what we mean by dialogue generally and what we probably even mean by multiculturalism. Sadly, I don't think in the world of politics there's any time or any inclination or desire to actually grasp these issues at great depth. It really is about the individual members of Parliament and the interests that they have. I think Joe comes to it as, if I can quote Plato, as a philosopher king. We don't have any philosopher kings in the Australian Parliament. I don't think we've got any philosopher kings in any parliament in the world. So that is a problem, I believe, as someone who operates in that world. It is a problem that we do not have that depth of thinking. And yes, when it comes to funding programs, politicians tend to opt for the short term, not interested necessarily in the long term, and it's about spreading as much of the pie as you can to make people happy. Whether in the end it's better to target it to a more narrow focus and spend more money developing something long term, whether that's a better option as opposed to a more general putting out a fire, band-aiding and moving on is a matter for debate. But that's the world that we live in. And the reason I've brought Geert Wilders with me is because in advancing a lot of the principles of dialogue that ought to lead and should lead to peace, we always have to be mindful that it's a matter of opinion and it's relative. And as I said, Geert Wilders, I'm sure if we brought him here, would be arguing that he was entering into dialogue as well and wanting to understand and communicate. But his message is not the sort of message that Joe, for example, is conveying that dialogue should promote and should lead to. And as for Australia, well, I don't know that we always think we're the centre of the world, but I actually believe very strongly, having lived here for 50 years, that we have everyone in this country, every faith, every background, every ethnicity, every language. We've managed to create a society that's not perfect, but it works well. And we have infrastructure and we have built intellectual infrastructure. We've built service delivery. So on both levels, we have an infrastructure that I think we can actually take to the international community. So rather than just being a country that sort of sits here and thinks it's doing all right, we need to be able to, I think, use interfaith dialogue as a part of our being a moderate, medium-sized power. I mean, we're not going to run the world as a warmonger, if I can use that term, but we are the kind of country, and always have been, that can play a very important role, whether it's in the sorts of work that were done here with the Turkish Cypriot and the Greek Cypriot dialogues, which I remember very well, and they were a first. And they may not have led to the resolution of the Cyprus problem, but they certainly have paved the way for the Greek Cypriot and Turkish community here in this country to come together. They certainly paved the way for me to visit the north of Cyprus when I did. So there are results. We get results. But one of the problems is I don't think we have successfully conveyed those results to the broader community so they can understand them as something that is not a waste of money or just a talk fest or, oh no, I'm not interested, it's all too academic. Our challenge is to find a way to, through education, through training, through better communication, but through harnessing all of the infrastructure and the thinking, through using our academics in a positive way, rather than isolating them as people that live in an ivory tower, finding a way of actually using the resources that we have for the betterment of our society, but also for for the international community. And I believe that very, very strongly. And finally, with the migration report, one of the two of the obvious things that came through in that inquiry, apart from the concern about Islam, was that the other one was the absolute gap that had been created after the John Howard government disbanded the Bureau of Immigration and Research and Multiculturalism, because once that went, there was no institute, there was no central body that was responsible for overseeing policy, assessing policy, monitoring, all those things that research does. So that, I guess, was one of the fault lines in where we had come to following the Howard government era, which was tied into September 11 and national security, and the whole point of multiculturalism being divisive and had to be abandoned, and the calls to find another word. We're now in a new era. We have a new government, and it remains to be seen how these issues will fare under a new government. The committee reported unanimously. There was no dissenting report from members of the opposition. Everybody agreed that multiculturalism and multi-faith was a good thing. Everybody agreed that, you know, Islam was not a threat to the Australian community. But now that opposition is government, and it will be very interesting to see what happens in the course of the next 3 years, because ultimately the things that we talk about here today and the things that we imagine to improve our society largely depend on governments as well, picking them up, funding them, making them public policy, because that's how you get to the broader Australian community. And governments, as I said, are not philosophy kings. They don't necessarily do things because it's for the greater good. The greater good could mean different things to different people. But governments are subject, and we do live in a democracy, to differences of views, and some of those views are out there in the suburbs. They're in my electorate, an electorate of people who were the IT group. That's why you probably didn't see such a high Christian participation in the iftar dinner initiatives, because it wasn't about the other faiths, it was about Islam, and they had to get up and take the initiatives and prove to the rest of the community, as perhaps the generations of migrants before them had to prove to the Australian community that they entered. They had to prove that they weren't a danger to it. And I think that they're the issues, certainly for me on the ground, that I take a close interest in and I keep a very close eye on. And I think the work that Jo does, I think the work that you do, I think the whole concept of interfaith as a way to peace is critical. And unfortunately, Jo, the Pope made a difference in Europe on refugees, but I'm afraid we're very far away, and I don't think the Pope has got as much capacity to make a difference here in Australia. And finally, I'll leave you with this. I'd like to know where the whole interfaith dialogue, and I'll ask you this and everyone else, where that fits into the growing, not only sense of, secularism. We've always been a secular state, but the whole concept of atheism and the reaction against faith, especially amongst young people today, and it's very strong. And so where does all this fit in? Because we'll end up just preaching to ourselves who have faith, and then a great number of people who don't, for whatever reason, are just not going to be involved in this dialogue. So it's an interesting challenge. And thank you, Jo, because you're a big visionary. Jo thinks big, and I'm sure that when you sat with Ian Paisley, I didn't know that, all those years ago, people might have thought, how could anyone possibly think they could achieve anything? And the point is that you can achieve, and Jo's absolutely right. There's no reason not to have dialogue with people just because you think you might offend them, or because it's problematic. And I'll finish on good old Geert Wilders. I missed the opportunity to have a cup of coffee with him. I did ask Cory Bernardi to set it up, who then fainted from shock because he couldn't understand why I'd want to talk to Geert Wilders. And I said, because I actually think we can teach him something. They were my words to my parliamentary colleague Cory Bernardi, and they would have been my words to Geert Wilders if I'd had the opportunity to meet with him, but I didn't. Thank you.
I'm going to invite Richard to give the vote of thanks to our two guests.
Thank you, Des. Before I trained for ministry in the Anglican Church, I was a teacher for 35 years in the electorates of Wills, Maribyrnong, Layla.
Missed call.
And on the 12th of September 2001, which of course was still the 11th in another part of the world, I was sitting in a classroom full of 14, 15 and 16-year-old young men and women. And I was sitting in a very, very confused classroom. I had spent the whole evening up watching television because I happened to be passing a television set at the middle of the night when a plane did that to a building. And I couldn't tear myself away from it. The next morning I was sitting with some 25 young men and women of all sorts of backgrounds, and it crossed my mind at that time that many of the relationships between these young men and women have changed forever with what we have just seen. My involvement with those things is what brought about my passion for multicultural and interfaith work and dialogue. And I thank, first of all, Joe for coming here tonight to stir us to action, to provoke us, as he put it, to do and to be a different sort of people of faith. People of faith who genuinely engage in dialogue, who genuinely seek true peace in this world through such dialogue. We need to be provoked in this way. Those of us who work in multi-faith and interfaith work, and my good brother chaplain from Swinburne University, Newton, who is here this evening, will understand what I'm saying here. Those of us who work in a multi-faith context sometimes lose sight of the fact that not everyone else does, and that it's not a given in every part of our society. And so we need people like Joe to provoke those of us for whom it is a passion to be more determined, to get out there and do more of it. And so, Joe, thank you for that. Thank you for the way in which you were able to speak to us this evening. Maria said that you were a philosopher king. I'm going to put it up one notch. I think, Joe, that you are one of the prophets for our time in this nation, because you are prepared to stand up and say sometimes what people don't want to hear, sometimes what people have never heard before, and often and mostly just what they darn well need to hear. And that you've done tonight, so thank you very much for that. And Maria, thank you for coming along this evening. Thank you for engaging with us here, bringing your perspective as a member of our Parliament, as a person who is involved in that fraught profession of politics. I've known many politicians in my time. I number some of them among my friends. It is a fraught profession. It is one which raises the very questions that Joe has raised for us in the hearts and minds of its members every day as they confront their task. And it is good that you were prepared to accept the invitation to come along this evening to respond to Joe's address to us and to give us the benefit of your experience and your engagement in this very area. I taught in one school which was full of Cypriots, and it was an interesting experience for both them and for me. But we, in fact, lived through that very time of great conflict away, and their hearts wanted to be there with their families, Their minds wanted to engage with the issue, but they were here and growing up here in Australia, and they still, because I still see them, they still talk about those days, because at school we actually thought, well, we'd better discuss this. And so, in a small way, I had my involvement there with that as well. So thank you both for being with us this evening. Thank you for what you have done to broaden our horizons in this area, and thank you again for being a prophet to our time. And thank you also for your dedication, Maria, to this work and this area.